The morning sun was already climbing high over Phoenix when I pulled my truck into the driveway of 847 Saguaro Lane. It was one of those Arizona days where the heat hits you like opening an oven door, even at 9 in the morning. I'd been doing home repairs for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of project imaginable. Broken pipes, collapsed roofs, foundation cracks that could swallow a small car. But nothing had prepared me for what would happen on this particular Tuesday. In June. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Thornfield had called 3 days earlier. Her voice was steady, professional, the kind of tone you'd expect from someone who had spent decades managing people and making decisions. She needed her back deck repaired, she said. The wooden planks were rotting. Some of the support beams looked questionable, and she was worried about safety. Standard job, I figured. 2 days, maybe 3 if the damage was worse than expected. When I knocked on her front door that morning, I expected to meet a typical suburban homeowner. Instead, I found myself face to face with a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Margaret Thornfield was tall, probably 5'8", with silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans that had seen better days and a faded university t-shirt. But it was her eyes that caught my attention. They held a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. "You must be David," she said, extending her hand for a firm shake. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "No problem at all, Mrs. Thornfield. Should we take a look at what we're dealing with?" She led me through her house, which was immaculate in that way that suggests someone spends a lot of time cleaning because they need something to keep their hands busy. Family photos lined the hallway walls, showing decades of Christmas mornings, graduations, and beach vacations. In most of them, Margaret stood beside a tall man with kind eyes and a ready smile. I noticed the photos seemed to stop around 5 years ago. The back deck was worse than I'd expected. Several planks had separated from the frame, creating gaps, wide enough to catch a foot. The railing wobbled when I tested it, and I could see daylight through cracks in some of the support posts. It wasn't just cosmetic damage. This deck was genuinely unsafe. "How long has it been like this?" I asked, running my hand along a particularly damaged section. Margaret crossed her arms, hugging herself despite the climbing temperature. "Honestly, about 2 years. Maybe longer. I kept meaning to get it fixed, but..." She trailed off, staring at the deck like it represented something much larger than rotting wood. I spent the next hour taking measurements, testing the structural integrity, and making notes about what needed to be replaced versus what could be salvaged. Margaret disappeared inside, but I could see her through the kitchen window, moving around restlessly, starting tasks and abandoning them. She'd pick up a dish, set it down, open a cabinet, close it again. It was the behavior of someone whose mind was somewhere else entirely. When I finished my assessment, I found her sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that looked like it had gone cold hours ago. She gestured for me to sit across from her, and I laid out my findings. The job would take 3 days, maybe 4. We'd need to replace about 60% of the decking, reinforce the support structure, and install a completely new railing system. "Whatever it costs," she said before I could even quote a price. "I just need it done." That should have been the end of our initial conversation. I should have given her an estimate, scheduled the work, and headed to my next appointment. But something about the way she said those words, with a kind of desperate finality, made me hesitate. "Mrs. Thornfield, is everything all right?" She looked up sharply, as if surprised that I'd asked. For a moment I thought she might tell me it was none of my business, which would have been perfectly reasonable. Instead, her shoulders sagged slightly, and she let out a long breath. "I'm sorry. I know I'm probably coming across as scattered. It's just been a difficult few months." I nodded, not wanting to pry, but also sensing that she needed someone to listen. "In my line of work, you learn to read people quickly. Some homeowners want to micromanage every nail you hammer. Others prefer to disappear until you're finished. But occasionally, you encounter someone who's dealing with something much bigger than home repairs, and they're grateful for any normal human interaction. The deck," she continued, "it was my husband's project, Robert. He started building it about 8 years ago, did most of the work himself. He was meticulous about everything, measured twice, cut once, all that. But then he got sick and she gestured vaguely toward the sliding door that led to the damaged deck. He never got to finish the railing. Said he'd get back to it when he felt better. The silence stretched between us, filled with the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic on the main road. I'd encountered this before, homeowners dealing with projects that carried emotional weight. Sometimes a broken fence represented a failed marriage, or a leaking roof symbolized everything falling apart. But there was something different about Margaret's situation, something that felt both heavier and more immediate. He passed away 14 months ago, she said quietly. Pancreatic cancer. By the time they caught it, there wasn't much they could do. I'm sorry for your loss. She nodded absently, as if she'd heard those words so many times they'd lost their meaning. The thing is, I've been avoiding this deck for over a year. Every time I looked at it, all I could see was Robert with his tape measure and his level, talking about grain patterns and proper spacing. But last week my daughter Emma was here with her kids, and my grandson almost fell through one of the loose planks. That's when I realized I couldn't keep putting this off. Margaret stood up and walked to the sliding door, looking out at the problematic deck. Emma thinks I should sell the house, move into one of those senior communities with maintenance-free living and organized activities. She means well, but she doesn't understand. This house isn't just where I live, it's where we built our life together. Robert and I bought this place when Emma was 12. We painted every room, planted every tree in the backyard, chose every light fixture. She turned back to face me, and I could see the conflict in her expression. But maybe she's right. I'm 54, and sometimes I feel like I'm 84. I wake up in this big house, and it's so quiet I can hear the refrigerator humming 3 rooms away. I go to the grocery store, and I still automatically buy Robert's favorite cereal before I remember. He's not coming home. I make dinner for 2 and end up eating leftovers for a week. The conversation had taken a turn I hadn't expected when I knocked on her door that morning. Margaret wasn't just a customer. She was someone at a crossroads, using a home repair project as a way to process much larger questions about her life and future. The deck represents something, I said carefully. Doesn't it? Margaret's eyes widened slightly, as if surprised that I'd understood. Yes. Exactly. If I can't even maintain the things Robert started, if I can't keep up with basic home maintenance, then maybe I really am kidding myself about staying here. Maybe Emma's right, and I should just admit that this chapter of my life is over. She returned to her seat at the kitchen table, and I noticed her hands were trembling slightly. But the thought of leaving terrifies me. This house holds every memory we made together. The kitchen where we cooked Sunday dinners for 20 years. The living room where we watched Emma graduate from high school on a live stream during COVID. The bedroom where Robert spent his last weeks, where we had our final conversations. The weight of her situation was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about fixing rotted wood. It was about Margaret's sense of identity and capability. The deck had become a test, a measuring stick for whether she could continue living independently in the home she'd shared with her husband. How long were you married? I asked. 26 years. We met when I was 28, both of us starting new. Jobs at the same company. I was in marketing. He was in engineering. Office romance, very scandalous. She smiled for the first time since I'd arrived, and it transformed her entire face. Emma always said we were disgustingly happy together. We were those people who still held hands in movie theaters and laughed at each other's terrible jokes. Margaret got up to refill her coffee cup, offering me one as well. As she moved around her kitchen, I could see glimpses of the person she'd been before grief settled over her like a heavy coat. Her movements became more fluid, her voice stronger. Robert always said I was the strongest person he knew. I organized our finances, planned our vacations, handled every crisis that came, our way. When his company downsized and he lost his job, I was the one who convinced him to start his own consulting business. When my mother had her stroke, I managed her care for 3 years. I thought I could handle anything. She sat back down, cradling her coffee cup like it was providing warmth despite the Arizona heat. But this is different. It's not a crisis. With a clear solution or a temporary setback we can overcome together. It's just emptiness. day after day of figuring out how to be me without being us. The rawness of her honesty was striking. In my experience, people rarely opened up to strangers about their deepest fears and struggles. But sometimes, talking to someone outside your normal circle feels safer. There's no history, no expectations, no need to maintain a brave face for people who've been watching you struggle. Emma keeps sending me brochures for retirement communities, Margaret continued. Bright, cheerful places with names like Sunset Manor and Golden Years Village. They all feature the same stock photos of silver-haired people playing tennis and doing watercolor painting. She's convinced that I need structure and social interaction, that I'm becoming isolated and depressed. She paused, staring into her coffee. The terrible thing is, she might be right. I've stopped returning calls from friends. I've declined invitations to book clubs and dinner parties. I order groceries online so I don't have to make small talk with checkout clerks who ask how I'm doing. I've become one of those people I used to worry about, the ones who disappear into their houses and slowly fade away. The kitchen fell quiet, again, and I found myself thinking about my own assumptions about grief and recovery. I'd expected Margaret to be focused on practical concerns, pricing and timelines. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, she was wrestling with fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and the possibility of starting over in middle age. But then I think about Robert, she said, her voice gaining strength. He never gave up on anything. When he decided to learn guitar at 45, he practiced every single day for 2 years until he could play our wedding song. When the doctors gave him 6 months, he fought for 14 and made every one of them count. He wouldn't want me to give up on our home, on our life here, just because maintaining it feels overwhelming. Margaret looked directly at me, and I could see a flicker of the determination that had carried her through previous challenges. That's why I called you. Not just because the deck needs fixing, but because I need to prove to myself that I can still take care of this place, that I can still take care of myself. The conversation had revealed layers of complexity I hadn't anticipated. Margaret wasn't just a widow dealing with home repairs. She was someone trying to rebuild her identity while honoring her past. The deck project had become symbolic of much larger questions about independence, capability, and the courage to continue building a life that looked completely different from the one she'd planned. As I sat in her kitchen that morning, listening to her story unfold, I realized that the next few days would involve much more than replacing rotted planks and installing new railings. I was being invited into a pivotal moment in someone's life, a crossroads where practical work and emotional healing would intersect in ways neither of us could have predicted. I arrived at Margaret's house the next morning at 7:30, my truck loaded with lumber, tools, and a renewed sense of purpose. The Arizona sun was already promising another scorching day, but the early hour provided a brief window of bearable working conditions. As I backed into her driveway, I noticed the curtains in her front window flutter slightly. She'd been watching, for me. Before I could even start unloading, Margaret appeared at her front door carrying a thermos and what looked like homemade muffins wrapped in a kitchen towel. She'd clearly been up for a while. Her hair was neatly braided, and she wore work clothes that suggested she planned to be more than just an observer. "I made coffee," she said, handing me the thermos. "And blueberry muffins. I couldn't sleep last night, so I figured I might as well bake something useful." The muffins were still warm, and the coffee was exactly the right strength. As I ate breakfast, leaning against my truck's tailgate, Margaret surveyed the materials I'd brought. She ran her hand along the new deck boards, testing their smoothness, and examined the galvanized bolts and brackets with the careful attention of someone who understood quality. "Robert would have approved of these choices," she said, picking up one of the pressure-treated posts. "He always said cheap materials were just expensive mistakes waiting to happen." I'd spent considerable time the previous evening selecting everything, partly because I wanted to do good work, but also because I sensed this project meant more to Margaret than typical home improvement. Every board needed to be straight. Every piece of hardware had to be exactly right. This wasn't just about building a functional deck, it was about proving that she could see important projects through to completion. "I'd like to help," Margaret said, as I began laying out my tools. "I know you probably work faster alone, but I need to be involved." Robert taught me how to use most basic tools, and I think it would be good for me to actually participate rather than just write a check. Many contractors would have politely declined the offer. Homeowner assistance often slows down the work and increases liability concerns. But something about Margaret's request felt essential to her healing process. She wasn't offering to help out of curiosity or boredom. She was asking to reclaim a piece of competence and control. "I'd appreciate the extra hands," I said. "We'll start by removing the damaged sections. I'll handle the power tools, but you can help with the manual work and keep me organized." The first task involved dismantling the existing deck structure. Years of Arizona weather had taken their toll on Robert's careful work. Screws had loosened, wood had warped and split, and several support beams showed signs of insect damage. As we worked together to remove the old planking, Margaret shared stories about the deck's history. "Robert installed this section during our first summer here," she said, pointing to a row of boards near the house. "Emma was 13 and complained endlessly about the noise. She wanted to spend the whole summer at the community pool with her friends, but Robert insisted she help with the project. He said it would teach her valuable skills." Margaret laughed, but there was sadness behind it. "Emma hated every minute of it. She sulked and complained and acted like holding boards steady while Robert cut them was some form of child abuse. But years later, when she bought her first house, she was the one who fixed her squeaky floors and painted her bathroom. Robert was so proud that his lessons had stuck." As we worked, I noticed Margaret's movements becoming more confident. She remembered how to properly remove screws without stripping them, how to stack lumber to prevent warping, and how to organize hardware so nothing got lost. Muscle memory was returning, along with a sense of competence that had been dormant since Robert's death. "I used to be good at this stuff," she said, successfully extracting a particularly stubborn screw. "Robert and I remodeled our entire first house ourselves. We were young and broke and thought we could handle anything. We probably made every mistake possible, but we learned as we went." The morning progressed steadily. Margaret proved to be an excellent assistant, anticipating what I needed and maintaining the organized workspace that efficient construction requires. More importantly, I could see the work affecting her mood. The focused concentration required to measure accurately and work safely seemed to quiet whatever anxious thoughts had been keeping her awake at night. Around 10 o'clock, we took a break in the shade of her patio umbrella. Margaret had prepared iced tea, and we sat looking at the pile of damaged lumber we'd removed from her deck. The destruction was significant, but it was also progress. Sometimes you have to tear something down completely before you can build it back better. "I called Emma last night," Margaret said, sipping her tea. "Told her about hiring you to fix the deck. She wasn't exactly supportive." I waited, sensing there was more to the story. "She thinks I'm wasting money on a house I should be selling. She's convinced that I'm making emotional decisions rather than practical ones. According to Emma, investing in repairs is just delaying the inevitable. She wants me to accept reality and start planning for the next phase of my life." Margaret set down her glass and stared at the construction mess surrounding us. "The thing is, I can see her point. The rational part of my brain knows that maintaining a 4-bedroom house by myself doesn't make financial sense. The property taxes alone are substantial, and there's always something that needs fixing or updating. From a purely logical perspective, downsizing would solve multiple problems. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance, and somewhere down the street, someone was running a leaf blower despite the early hour. Normal suburban sounds that formed the backdrop of Margaret's daily life. Sounds that would disappear if she moved to a retirement community with its own different rhythms and routines. But logic isn't everything," she continued. "This house represents the life Robert and I built together. Every room has memories attached to it. The kitchen where we cooked together for 20 years. The garage where he restored his vintage motorcycle. The guest room where Emma stayed when she came. Home from college with her laundry and her heartbreaks." Margaret's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "Emma sees those things as anchors holding me back from moving forward. She thinks I'm clinging to the past instead of embracing new possibilities. But what if they're not anchors? What if they're roots? What if this house isn't keeping me stuck, but keeping me grounded?" The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a delivery truck bringing additional materials I'd ordered. As we unloaded composite decking boards and stainless steel hardware, Margaret examined each item with renewed interest. She asked questions about the differences between materials, why certain choices were better for Arizona's climate, and how long various components were expected to last. Robert always researched everything exhaustively before making decisions, she said, running her finger along the textured surface of a composite board. He'd spend weeks reading reviews and comparing specifications. I used to tease him about his obsessive preparation, but his thoroughness meant we rarely had to redo projects or replace things prematurely. By noon, we'd cleared away all the damaged decking and begun assessing the underlying support structure. Several of the joists needed reinforcement, and 2 required complete replacement. The work was more extensive than I'd initially estimated, but Margaret seemed pleased rather than discouraged by the complexity. "This is exactly what Robert would have done," she said, helping me measure for new support beams. "He never took shortcuts, never settled for quick fixes that would cause problems later. He used to say that doing something right the first time was always faster than doing it twice." As we worked through the afternoon heat, Margaret shared more stories about her marriage and the projects she and Robert had tackled together. Each anecdote revealed layers of partnership and shared purpose that extended far beyond home improvement. They'd been genuine collaborators, approaching challenges as a team and finding satisfaction in solving problems together. "People always commented on how well we worked together," Margaret said, helping me level a new support beam. "We never argued about projects, never got frustrated with each other's different approaches. Robert was methodical and precise, while I was more intuitive and flexible. Somehow our different styles complemented each other perfectly." The observation led to a deeper conversation about partnership and the challenges of making decisions alone after decades of collaboration. Margaret described the paralysis she'd experienced since Robert's death, the difficulty of choosing between options when there was no one to discuss pros and cons with, no one to provide a different perspective or catch potential problems. "Even simple decisions feel overwhelming now," she admitted. What to have for dinner, which route to take to the grocery store, whether to replace the living room carpet. Robert and I talked through everything, even tiny choices, not because we couldn't decide things independently, but because we enjoyed the process of thinking through options together. As the day progressed, Margaret's confidence continued to grow. She remembered how to use a speed square, how to mark boards for accurate cuts, and how to check measurements twice before committing to permanent changes. More than technical skills, she was rediscovering her capacity to tackle complex projects and see them through to completion. "I'd forgotten how satisfying this kind of work can be," she said, admiring the precisely cut end of a support beam. "There's something wonderful about having a clear problem and the tools to solve it. No ambiguity, no emotional complexity, just measurement, cutting, and assembly." By late afternoon, we'd made substantial progress on the structural repairs. The new support system was significantly stronger than what we'd removed, and Margaret had been involved in every aspect of the work. She'd held boards steady while I cut them, helped position heavy beams, and even made several measurements herself. "Emma would be shocked to see me like this," Margaret said, wiping sawdust from her hands. "She thinks I've become helpless and dependent, someone who needs to be taken care of rather than someone capable of taking care of herself. But this feels more like who I really am than the person I've been for the past year." As we cleaned up tools and covered materials with tarps, Margaret reflected on the day's work and what it meant for her sense of capability and confidence. The physical labor had been demanding, but it had also been empowering. She'd proven to herself that she could still learn new skills, work with her hands, and contribute meaningfully to challenging projects. "Tomorrow we start installing the new decking," I said, loading tools back into my truck. "That's when you'll really see the progress." Margaret nodded, looking at the skeletal framework we'd created. It wasn't beautiful yet, but it was solid and properly engineered, a foundation that could support whatever came next. "Thank you for letting me help," she said. "I know I probably slowed you down, but this has been the best day I've had since Robert died. I feel useful again, competent again. Like maybe I'm stronger than I've been giving myself credit for." As I drove away that evening, I thought about the transformation I'd witnessed. Margaret had started the day uncertain about her capabilities and questioning her decision to maintain her home. She was ending it with renewed confidence and a clearer sense of her own strength. The deck project was becoming exactly what she'd hoped, proof that she could still tackle complex challenges and see them through to successful completion. The third day started differently. When I arrived at Margaret's house, I found her sitting on her front steps with a cup of coffee, already dressed and ready to work. But something had changed overnight. Her posture was tense, her expression troubled, and she barely acknowledged my greeting. "Everything all right?" I asked, unloading my tools with deliberately slow movements to give her time to respond. She stared at her coffee for a long moment before answering. "Emma drove up from Tucson last night. Unannounced. She's inside making phone calls to real estate agents." The weight of her words settled between us like dust in still air. I'd sensed this confrontation was coming, but the timing couldn't have been worse. We were at the crucial stage of the deck project, where precise measurements and careful installation would determine the quality of the finished product. Margaret needed to be focused, not distracted by family pressure. "She saw the work we've been doing," Margaret continued, gesturing toward the partially completed deck frame. "Instead of being impressed or supportive, she became more convinced that I'm wasting money and avoiding reality. According to Emma, hiring a contractor proves that I can't maintain this place myself." I set down my tool bag and joined Margaret on the front steps. Sometimes the most important part of a project happens away from the actual construction site. "What do you think?" I asked. Margaret's laugh was bitter. "That's exactly what Emma asked me, except she phrased it differently. She wanted to know when I was going to stop pretending I could handle this house and start making sensible decisions about my future." Through the front window, I could hear a woman's voice speaking rapidly into a phone, discussing market conditions and pricing strategies. Emma was clearly not wasting time on subtle persuasion. "The thing is," Margaret said, lowering her voice, "part of me wonders if she's right. Yesterday felt so good, working with my hands, feeling competent and useful. But then I woke up this morning with aching muscles and blisters on my palms, and I thought about all the other projects this house will need. The roof, the HVAC system, the landscaping. Can I really handle all of that alone?" This was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since our first conversation. Margaret wasn't just questioning her ability to complete the deck project. She was questioning her entire vision of her future. The physical work had boosted her confidence, but it had also highlighted the magnitude of home ownership responsibilities. "Tell me about yesterday evening," I said. "After I left. How did you feel?" Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Exhausted but satisfied. I took a long bath, ordered Chinese takeout, and sat on my couch looking at what we'd accomplished. For the first time in months, I felt proud of something. I felt like I'd proven I could still tackle difficult challenges. And then Emma arrived. With her spreadsheets and her brochures and her absolute certainty that she knows what's best for me." Margaret's voice carried a mix of frustration and hurt. She doesn't see a mother who's rediscovering her strength. She sees an aging woman in denial about her limitations. The front door opened, and Emma Thornfield stepped onto the porch. She was clearly Margaret's daughter, the same tall frame, the same intelligent eyes. But where Margaret moved with careful consideration, Emma radiated impatient energy. She wore a business suit despite the early hour and the rising heat, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions and having them implemented. "You must be David," she said, extending her hand for a brief professional shake. "I'm Emma Mitchell. Thank you for the work you've done, but I'm afraid we'll need to discuss some changes to the project scope." Margaret stood up slowly, and I could see her preparing for battle. "Emma, we talked about this last night. The decision is mine to make. Mom, be reasonable. You hired a contractor because you can't do this work yourself. That proves my point about the house being too much for you to handle alone." The conversation was heading toward the kind of family argument that leaves everyone hurt and nothing resolved. I'd witnessed similar conflicts before, where practical concerns became entangled with deeper issues of autonomy, respect, and fear. Emma's worry for her mother was genuine, but her approach was undermining the very independence she claimed to want to protect. "Actually," I interjected carefully, "your mother has been doing most of the work herself. I'm essentially providing tools and expertise, but she's been involved in every aspect of the project. Yesterday, she cut boards, installed support beams, and problem-solved construction challenges. She's far more capable than she's been giving herself credit for." Emma's expression shifted from polite dismissal to genuine surprise. Really? Margaret straightened her shoulders. Really? I remembered skills I thought I'd forgotten. I solved problems, made decisions, and contributed meaningfully to challenging work. Yesterday was the first day since your father died that I felt like myself. Again. For a moment, the three of us stood in awkward silence. Emma was clearly recalibrating her assumptions about her mother's capabilities, while Margaret was asserting her competence in a way that brooked no argument. The deck project had become a symbol of much more than home maintenance. It represented Margaret's claim to continued independence and self-determination. But Mom, Emma said, her voice gentler now. Even if you can handle this project, what about everything else? The yard work, the utility repairs, the seasonal maintenance? This house requires constant attention. It was a fair question, and one that Margaret had been wrestling with herself. Completing one successful project didn't automatically solve all the challenges of single home ownership, but it did prove that those challenges weren't insurmountable. I don't have all the answers, Margaret admitted, but I have more options than just giving up and moving away. I can hire help when I need it, learn new skills when I want to, and make decisions based on what I actually experience rather than what I fear might happen. Emma glanced at the deck framework, taking in the precise measurements and solid construction. Can I see what you've been doing? Margaret led us to the backyard, explaining each stage of the project and her role in the work. Emma listened with the focused attention of someone reassessing a complex situation. She asked technical questions, tested the stability of new support beams, and examined the quality of the materials we'd chosen. This is actually really impressive, Emma said finally. I had no idea you remembered so much from those projects you and Dad did together. I didn't either, Margaret replied. But muscle memory is a powerful thing. Once I started working with tools again, it felt natural, familiar, like riding a bicycle after years away from cycling. Emma sat down on the edge of the deck frame, looking out at the backyard her parents had cultivated over 2 decades. Mature trees provided shade, established flower beds added color, and the overall landscape spoke of years of careful attention and love. I've been so focused on the practical challenges that I haven't really considered what leaving would mean, Emma said quietly. Not just for you, but for our family history. This is where I spent my teenage years, where I brought boyfriends to meet you and Dad, where I came when my marriage fell apart, and I needed to remember what healthy relationships looked like. Margaret sat beside her daughter, and I could see some of the tension between them beginning to ease. I understand why you're worried. The house is a big responsibility, and I haven't been handling it well since your father died. But maybe the solution isn't to run away from the challenge. Maybe it's to approach it differently. What do you mean? I mean hiring help when I need it instead of trying to do everything myself. Learning to ask for assistance without feeling like I'm admitting defeat. Building a support network that allows me to stay here safely while acknowledging my limitations honestly. Emma looked around the yard again, and I could see her beginning to envision possibilities rather than just problems. You could hire a lawn service for the heavy yard work. Maybe find a handyman for routine maintenance tasks. Set up relationships with reliable contractors for bigger projects. Exactly. Independence doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means having the resources and judgment to get help when you need it, while maintaining control over the important decisions. I'd been listening to this conversation with growing respect for both women. Emma's concerns were valid and came from a place of love, while Margaret's desire for autonomy was both understandable and achievable with proper planning. The deck project had catalyzed a family discussion that needed to happen, forcing both mother and daughter to examine their assumptions about aging, capability, and independence. There's something else, Margaret said, her voice taking on a different quality. Something I haven't told you, because I wasn't sure how you'd react. Emma waited, and I sensed we were approaching the heart of whatever had been troubling Margaret since my arrival that morning. I've been thinking about getting a dog. Of all the revelations I might have expected, this wasn't one of them. Emma's expression showed similar surprise. A dog? A companion. Someone to share the house with, to give me a reason to maintain routines and get exercise. Your father and I always talked about getting a dog after you left for college, but somehow we never got around to it. Too busy with work, too much travel. always something else taking priority. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued. But now I have the time and the space, and I think it would be good for me. Good for the house, too. Dogs make homes feel lived in, rather than just maintained. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this unexpected development. What kind of dog? I've been researching breeds that do well with single owners. Maybe a golden retriever or a Labrador. Something friendly and trainable, but also protective. A dog that would enjoy walks around the neighborhood and lazy afternoons in the backyard. I found myself smiling at the image Margaret was painting. A dog would indeed change the dynamics of her solitary life, providing companionship, routine, and a sense of purpose that extended beyond home maintenance projects. That's actually a wonderful idea, Emma said, and I could hear genuine enthusiasm in her voice. Remember how much you loved Duke when you were growing up? Duke was a German shepherd who lived to be 14, Margaret explained to me. He was my constant companion from the time I was 8 until I left for college. Best friend I ever had until I met your father. The conversation had taken an unexpected turn toward hope and possibility, rather than limitation and loss. The deck project had created space for Margaret to rediscover her capabilities, and now those capabilities were expanding into other areas of life planning. If you're serious about staying here and making it work, Emma said, then I want to help you set up systems that will actually support that goal. Not because I think you can't handle things yourself, but because everyone needs backup plans and support networks. Margaret reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. I'd appreciate that. I've been so focused on proving I could manage alone that I forgot how much I value your input and assistance. Independence and isolation aren't the same thing. We resumed work on the deck that afternoon. The atmosphere had completely changed. Emma stayed to observe and even helped with some of the simpler tasks. She saw firsthand how focused and competent her mother was when engaged in purposeful work. And Margaret demonstrated that accepting help didn't diminish her autonomy. You know what? Emma said as we finished installing the first row of decking boards. This looks like it's going to be beautiful. Dad would be proud of what you're accomplishing. Margaret smiled, running her hand along the smooth surface of the new deck. I think he would be. But more than that, I think he'd be proud that I'm not giving up on the life we built together. I'm just learning to live it differently. By the end of the day, we'd made significant progress on the decking installation, and Margaret had made even more significant progress on her relationship with her daughter. The deck project had become a catalyst for honest conversations about fear, capability, and the many different ways to define independence in the face of life's changes. The fourth morning brought an unexpected phone call that would change everything. I was loading my truck when my cell phone rang, displaying Margaret's number at barely 7 o'clock. David, I'm sorry to call so early, but I need to ask you something important. Her voice carried an urgency I hadn't heard before. How do you feel about dogs? The question caught me completely off guard. Dogs? I love dogs. Why? Because there's a golden retriever at the animal shelter who's about to be put down today, and I think I might want to adopt him. But I need someone objective to come with me and help me make this decision. Emma flew back to Tucson this morning, and I don't trust myself to think clearly about such a big choice. Within an hour, we were driving toward the Maricopa County Animal Shelter instead of working on deck boards and railings. Margaret sat in the passenger seat of my truck, nervously adjusting her purse strap and second-guessing her impulsive decision to respond to an online adoption posting she'd seen at 5 that morning. His name is Charlie, she said, reading from a printout she'd made. He's 7 years old, house-trained, and good with children. His previous owner died 6 months ago, and the family couldn't keep him. He's been at the shelter for 3 months, which is apparently much longer than usual for golden retrievers. The shelter was busier than I'd expected for a weekday morning. Families with children looked at puppies, young couples discussed the responsibilities of pet ownership, and elderly people sat quietly with cats who seemed to understand that this might be their last chance for a home. Margaret checked in at the front desk, and we were directed to a series of outdoor runs where larger dogs were housed. Charlie was in the third enclosure, lying on a blanket in a patch of morning shade. He was clearly a purebred golden retriever, though his coat showed signs of stress and inadequate grooming. When he saw us approaching, he stood slowly and walked to the chain-link fence with the patient dignity of a dog who had learned not to expect too much from human visitors. "Oh my," Margaret breathed, kneeling down to Charlie's eye level. "Hello there, beautiful boy." Charlie's tail began a tentative wag. He pressed his nose against the fence, and Margaret extended her fingers so he could sniff her hand. The connection was immediate and unmistakable. This wasn't just a woman considering a pet adoption. This was a recognition between two souls who had both experienced loss and loneliness. A shelter volunteer named Jessica joined us with Charlie's medical records and behavioral assessment. "He's a special dog," she said, unlocking the gate so we could enter the run. "Very gentle, extremely well-trained, and clearly bonded strongly with his previous owner. We think that's why he's been having trouble adjusting to shelter life. He's grieving." Margaret sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, and Charlie immediately approached her. He didn't jump or demand attention. Instead, he simply leaned against her side and rested his head on her shoulder. It was a gesture of such trust and need that I felt my throat tighten. "How much time do I have to decide?" Margaret asked, stroking Charlie's ears. "Technically, today is his last day," Jessica replied. "But if you're seriously considering adoption, we can hold him for 24 hours while you finalize arrangements. The paperwork takes some time anyway." Margaret looked at me over Charlie's head. "What do you think? Am I crazy to take on this responsibility?" I watched Charlie settle more fully against Margaret, his eyes closing contentedly for the first time since we'd arrived. "I think you'd be crazy not to. Look at him. He's already chosen you." The adoption process was more involved than I'd expected. Margaret had to provide references, proof of home ownership, and details about her experience with pets. She answered questions about her daily schedule, her yard setup, and her plans for veterinary care. Throughout the interview, Charlie remained calmly by her side, as if sensing that his future hung in the balance. "There's one thing I need to mention," Margaret told Jessica. "I'm 54 and recently widowed. My daughter thinks I should be downsizing my life, not taking on new responsibilities. But I feel like Charlie and I might be exactly what each other needs." Jessica smiled. "Some of our best adoption matches are between older dogs and mature adults. You both have patience. You understand commitment, and you're not looking for a pet to entertain children or impress neighbors. You want a genuine companion." While we waited for the paperwork to process, Margaret and I took Charlie for a walk around the shelter's exercise area. He heeled perfectly without a leash, responded to basic commands, and showed the kind of gentle manners that spoke of excellent training and a loving home environment. His previous owner was an elderly gentleman named Frank, Jessica explained. When we returned, Frank adopted Charlie as a puppy and spent 7 years training him to be the perfect companion. When Frank had his heart attack, Charlie stayed by his side for 2 days until neighbors found them. He's been lost ever since. The story hit Margaret visibly. She knelt down and cupped Charlie's face in her hands. "I know exactly how you feel, sweet boy. I know what it's like to lose your best friend and not know how to move forward." By noon, the adoption was complete. Charlie had a new collar, a bag of his preferred food, and a collection of toys that Jessica recommended. More importantly, he had Margaret, who was already planning his integration into their shared life with the thoroughness that characterized all her important decisions. "We'll need to stop at the pet store for supplies," she said, as we loaded Charlie into my truck. "And I should call my veterinarian to schedule a checkup. Oh, and the deck project. I hope you don't mind having a canine supervisor for the rest of the work." Charlie rode in the back seat with his head resting on Margaret's shoulder, alert but calm as we drove through Phoenix traffic toward his new home. I caught glimpses of them in my rearview mirror. Margaret talking softly to Charlie, Charlie responding with gentle nuzzles and contentment sighs. At the pet store, Margaret approached dog ownership with the same methodical preparation she'd brought to the deck project. She researched food brands, compared leash options, and selected toys based on Charlie's size and energy level. The store clerk, clearly impressed by her thoroughness, offered advice about local dog parks and recommended a grooming service. "I'll want to do this right," Margaret explained to me as we loaded supplies into the truck. "Charlie has already lost one home. I want to make sure his new life with me is everything he deserves." Back at Margaret's house, Charlie explored his new environment with careful curiosity. He investigated every room, sniffed the furniture, and tested the comfort level of various potential sleeping spots. When we went into the backyard to check, On the deck project, Charlie immediately claimed a shady spot where he could observe our work while staying cool. "Look at that," Margaret said, watching Charlie settle into his chosen supervision position. "He already knows this is home." We spent the afternoon completing the decking installation, while Charlie provided moral support and occasional comic relief. He had clearly been around construction projects before. He stayed out of the work area but remained close enough to feel included. When Margaret took breaks, Charlie appeared at her side, as if summoned by some invisible signal. "This changes everything," Margaret said during one of our water breaks. "Having Charlie here makes the house feel alive again. Not the same as when Robert was here, but alive in a different way. Like there's a future here worth building toward." As we worked, Margaret talked about her plans for Charlie's integration into her daily routine. Morning walks around the neighborhood, afternoon naps in the air conditioning, evening playtime in the backyard. She was already thinking about dog-proofing the house, establishing feeding schedules, and researching training classes. "Emma is going to be shocked," Margaret said, laughing as Charlie investigated a pile of sawdust with scientific thoroughness. "She thinks I'm not ready for additional responsibilities, and here I've adopted a 70-pound dog who's going to need daily exercise and constant companionship." But as the afternoon progressed, it became clear that Charlie was exactly the companion Margaret needed. He provided structure to her day, purpose beyond home maintenance, and the kind of unconditional affection that helped fill the emotional void left by Robert's death. More than that, Charlie needed Margaret as much as she needed him. "You know what I realized today?" Margaret said as we cleaned up tools at the end of the workday. "Age really is just a number. I spent months thinking of myself as someone whose active life was winding down, someone who should be preparing for decline and dependence. But Charlie doesn't care that I'm 54. He doesn't see an aging widow who might not be capable of caring for him properly. He sees someone who offers love, stability, and the kind of attention he's been missing." Charlie, as if understanding that he was the subject of conversation, wandered over and leaned against Margaret's legs. She scratched behind his ears, and his tail wagged with genuine happiness. "I've been so focused on what I've lost and what I might not be able to do that, I forgot to consider what I still have to offer," Margaret continued. "I have experience, patience, resources, and a big heart that's been aching for someone to love. Charlie gives me a chance to be needed again, to matter to someone in a daily practical way." As I prepared to leave that evening, Margaret was already establishing evening routines with Charlie. She'd set up his food and water bowls in the kitchen, arranged his bed in the living room where he could see multiple entrances, and begun the process of teaching him the layout and rules of his new home. "Thank you for coming with me today," she said, walking me to my truck. "I don't think I would have had the courage to adopt Charlie without moral support, but I also don't think I would have recognized how much I needed him." Charlie followed us outside, already protective of Margaret and curious about anyone who interacted with her. He sat politely as we said goodbye, but his attention remained focused on Margaret, as if he understood that she was now his primary responsibility. The next morning arrived with an unexpected complication. When I pulled into Margaret's driveway, I found her standing in the front yard holding a phone to her ear, her free hand gesturing animatedly while Charlie sat patiently at her feet. Even from a distance, I could tell the conversation wasn't going well. "No, Emma, I did not adopt a dog on impulse," Margaret was saying as I approached. "Yes, I understand it's a big responsibility. No, I don't need you to drive back up here to talk sense into me." Charlie's tail wagged when he saw me, but he remained seated beside Margaret, as if he understood his job was to provide moral support during difficult phone calls. I gave him a quiet pat and began unloading tools, trying to give Margaret privacy for what was clearly a challenging family discussion. "Because I'm 54, not 84, Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. "Because I've successfully cared for living creatures before, including you for 18 years. Because Charlie and I are both adults who are perfectly capable of taking care of each other." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Margaret patiently but firmly defending her decision, while Emma apparently listed every possible concern about senior pet ownership. When Margaret finally ended the call, she looked frustrated but not defeated. "Let me guess," I said. "Emma thinks adopting Charlie proves you're making emotional decisions instead of practical ones." According to Emma, I'm exhibiting classic signs of someone who's not thinking clearly about their limitations. She's convinced that I'm setting myself up for failure and heartbreak. Margaret scratched behind Charlie's ears, and he leaned into her touch with obvious contentment. She wants me to return him to the shelter before I get too attached. The suggestion seemed absurd given the obvious bond that had already formed between Margaret and Charlie. They moved around each other with an easy synchronization that suggested years of companionship rather than less than 24 hours of acquaintance. What? Did you tell her? Charlie and I are going to prove her wrong, starting with finishing this deck project and showing that I can handle multiple responsibilities simultaneously. Margaret's determination was unmistakable. Emma sees problems where I see possibilities. She sees additional burdens where I see renewed purpose. We spent the morning working on the deck railing while Charlie supervised from his chosen spot in the shade. Margaret had clearly researched railing installation techniques overnight. She arrived with printed articles about proper spacing, height requirements, and safety considerations. Her thoroughness was impressive, but more importantly, her confidence had solidified overnight. I called the veterinarian this morning, she said, measuring distances between railing posts. Charlie has an appointment next week for a complete checkup and to establish his medical records. I also researched local dog parks and found 3 within a reasonable driving distance. As we worked, Margaret shared her evolving plans for life with Charlie. She'd identified a dog walker for days when her own schedule might be too demanding, located an excellent boarding facility for any future travel, and even researched pet insurance options. Her approach was methodical and realistic, addressing potential challenges before they became problems. Emma thinks I'm being impulsive, but this is actually the most carefully planned decision I've made since Robert died, Margaret said, holding a railing section steady while I secured it with screws. I've thought through every aspect of dog ownership, from daily care routines to emergency veterinary expenses. Around mid-morning, we were interrupted by the arrival of Margaret's next-door neighbor, an elderly man named Harold who introduced himself with the slow deliberation of someone who doesn't often have opportunities for conversation. He'd noticed our construction activity and wanted to investigate the improvements being made to the neighborhood. New deck looks solid, Harold said, running his hand along our completed railing section. Much better than the old one. That was getting dangerous. Charlie approached Harold cautiously, and I watched Margaret monitor the interaction carefully. Harold extended his hand for Charlie to sniff, then scratched the dog's chest when Charlie indicated his approval. Beautiful golden, Harold observed. Haven't seen one in the neighborhood for years. Good choice for a companion dog. His name is Charlie, Margaret said. I adopted him yesterday from the county shelter. He's 7 years old and very well trained. Harold's expression brightened considerably. My late wife always said Goldens were the perfect family dogs. Smart, loyal, and gentle with everyone they meet. This fellow looks like he knows how to behave himself. The conversation continued for nearly half an hour, with Harold sharing stories about the various dogs who had lived in the neighborhood over the decades. Margaret listened attentively, asking questions about local pet policies and recommendations for services. I realized this was her first extended conversation with a neighbor since Robert's death, and Charlie was providing a natural bridge to social connections she'd been avoiding. If you ever need someone to check on Charlie when you're away, I'm usually home, Harold offered. My yard connects to yours in the back, so he could see me through the fence. Might be good for both of us to have some company. After Harold left, Margaret seemed energized by the social interaction. I'd forgotten how friendly the neighbors are. Since Robert died, I've been avoiding conversations, staying inside when I see people walking by. But Charlie changes that dynamic. People want to meet him, and meeting him means talking to me. We spent the afternoon installing the remaining railing sections and beginning work on the deck stairs. Margaret's skills had improved dramatically over the course of the project. She now measured accurately, cut precisely, and assembled components with minimal guidance. More importantly, she was making independent decisions about construction details, trusting her own judgment about aesthetics and functionality. I want to stain the deck a darker color than the original, she said, examining color samples from the hardware store. Robert always preferred natural wood tones, but I think a richer stain would complement the house better and provide better protection against the Arizona sun. The decision seemed minor, but it represented something significant. Margaret was making choices based on her own preferences rather than maintaining everything exactly as Robert had left it. She was honoring their shared past while claiming ownership of her individual future. Charlie proved to be an excellent construction assistant. He stayed out of the work area but remained close enough to feel involved. When Margaret took breaks, he materialized at her side. When tools were dropped, he investigated them carefully but didn't interfere. Most importantly, his presence seemed to calm Margaret's occasional moments of self-doubt. "Having Charlie here makes everything feel more manageable," Margaret said during our afternoon water break. "When I start questioning whether I'm taking on too much, I look at him and remember that we're both stronger than we've been giving ourselves credit for." Late in the afternoon, Emma called back. This time, Margaret put the call on speaker so I could hear both sides of the conversation while we continued working. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning," Emma began. "I may have been too harsh about the dog situation." "What changed your mind?" Margaret asked, continuing to sand a railing section while she talked. "I called Aunt Susan and told her about Charlie. She reminded me how much you loved Duke when you were growing up, and how devastated you were when he died. She also pointed out that you've never made truly impulsive decisions about anything important in your entire life." Margaret smiled, and I could hear Emma's tone softening as she continued. "Susan also mentioned that her neighbor adopted a senior dog last year, and it completely transformed her life. She has more energy, stays more active, and seems genuinely happy for the first time since her husband passed away." "Charlie is already having that effect," Margaret said. "I woke up this morning with a sense of purpose I haven't felt in months. Not just because he needs care, but because he gives me a reason to think about the future in positive terms." "Can you send me a picture of him?" Emma asked. "I want to see this dog who's apparently revolutionizing my mother's life." Margaret spent several minutes trying to photograph Charlie with her phone while maintaining her hold on the railing section. Charlie, sensing he was the center of attention, posed with the dignity of a professional model. When Margaret finally captured a suitable image and sent it to Emma, the response was immediate. "Oh my goodness, Mom, he's gorgeous. He looks like a teddy bear. No wonder you fell in love with him instantly." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Emma asking detailed questions about Charlie's background, health status, and personality. Margaret answered each question thoroughly, demonstrating the research and preparation she'd invested in the adoption decision. "I owe you an apology," Emma said finally. "I've been so focused on protecting you from potential problems that I haven't been supporting the positive changes you're making. The deck project, adopting Charlie, reconnecting with neighbors. These are all signs that you're building a fulfilling life, not evidence that you're making poor decisions." "Tomorrow we'll finish the stairs and apply the first coat of stain," I said, packing tools into my truck. "After that, you'll have the deck Robert started and the fresh beginning you've been building toward." Margaret looked at the nearly completed project with obvious pride. "It's going to be beautiful. But more than that, it's going to be mine. Built with my own hands, completed with my own determination, and shared with Charlie for whatever adventures come next." As I drove home that evening, I thought about the transformation I'd witnessed over the course of the week. Margaret had evolved from someone questioning her capabilities to someone confidently planning her future. The deck project had been the catalyst, but her own courage and resilience had been the driving forces behind every positive change. The addition of Charlie had completed something that work alone couldn't achieve. Margaret now had daily purpose, emotional connection, and a living reminder that love and loyalty were still possible even after devastating loss. At 54, she wasn't winding down her active life. She was launching the next chapter with wisdom, resources, and a golden retriever who believed she was exactly the person he'd been waiting for. The final day of the deck project dawned with an unusual coolness for June in Phoenix. A rare cloud cover had moved in overnight, creating perfect conditions for staining and finishing work. When I arrived at Margaret's house, I found her and Charlie already waiting on the front porch, both looking ready to tackle the day's challenges. "I have a confession," Margaret said as I unloaded the staining supplies. "I woke up at 5 this morning and couldn't go back to sleep. Not because I was anxious, but because I was excited. Today we finish what we started, and I wanted to savor every moment of it." Charlie wagged his tail in greeting, then immediately trotted to his supervisory position near the deck. Over the past week, he'd established a routine that perfectly complemented our work schedule. His presence had become so natural that I couldn't imagine completing the project without his quiet oversight. We began by applying wood conditioner to prepare the deck surface for staining. Margaret worked with Methodical precision, covering every board evenly while avoiding drips and puddles that could create uneven color absorption. Her technique had improved dramatically since the project's beginning. She now handled tools with confidence and made adjustments based on her own assessment rather than waiting for my guidance. "I've been thinking about what comes after this project," Margaret said, working her way across a section of decking. "Not just maintaining the deck, but what other improvements I might want to make to the house." The comment surprised me. A week ago, Margaret had been questioning whether she could handle basic home maintenance. Now she was contemplating additional projects, thinking about the house as something to enhance rather than simply preserve. "What kind of improvements?" "The master bathroom needs updating. Robert and I talked about renovating it for years, but we never got around to it. The tile is from the 1990s, the vanity is too small, and the lighting is terrible." Margaret paused her work to gesture toward the house. "I'm thinking about hiring professionals for the major work, but doing some of the preparation and finishing myself." The transformation in her thinking was remarkable. Margaret was no longer seeing herself as someone whose capabilities were declining. She was planning projects that would extend years into the future. More significantly, she was approaching these plans with realistic assessment of her skills and practical strategies for getting professional help when needed. Around mid-morning, we were interrupted by an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 60s approached from the sidewalk, walking a small terrier who seemed intensely interested in meeting Charlie. Margaret looked up from her staining work with curiosity, rather than the defensive posture she might have adopted a week earlier. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the woman said, "but I live 3 houses down, and I've been watching your deck project with admiration. I'm Linda Patterson, and this is Buster." She gestured to the terrier, who was straining against his leash to investigate Charlie more thoroughly. Margaret stood and wiped her hands on a rag before approaching the fence. "I'm Margaret Thornfield, and this is Charlie. We'd love to meet Buster properly if you'd like to bring him into the yard." The introduction went smoothly, with both dogs displaying the polite curiosity of well-socialized animals. Linda admired the deck construction while sharing stories about her own home improvement projects and the challenges of maintaining a house as a single woman. Margaret listened attentively, occasionally asking questions about contractors Linda had used or problems she'd encountered. "I have to admit, I was a bit worried when I heard about Robert's passing," Linda said. "Not because I doubted your abilities, but because this neighborhood has lost several longtime residents recently, and I was afraid we might lose the sense of community we've built over the years." Margaret's expression softened. "I considered moving. My daughter thought it would be the practical choice. But this house represents more than just where I live. It's where I belong. Working on this deck has reminded me that I can take care of this place and continue contributing to the neighborhood." The conversation revealed that Linda faced many of the same challenges Margaret had been wrestling with. She was a widow who had initially struggled with home maintenance but had gradually built a network of reliable contractors and helpful neighbors. Her perspective on aging in place was both realistic and optimistic, acknowledging limitations while emphasizing adaptability. "The key is being honest about what you can handle yourself and what requires professional help," Linda said. "I can still paint rooms and maintain flower beds, but I hire someone for roof work and major plumbing repairs. There's no shame in recognizing your boundaries and working within them intelligently." After Linda and Buster left, Margaret seemed energized by the encounter. "I didn't realize how much I'd missed casual conversations with neighbors. Since Robert died, I've been so focused on grieving and surviving that I forgot about the simple pleasure of community connections." We resumed work on the deck staining, applying the rich mahogany color Margaret had selected. The transformation was dramatic. The new stain enhanced the wood grain while providing protection against Arizona's intense UV exposure. More importantly, the color choice reflected Margaret's personal taste, rather than simply maintaining what Robert had originally planned. "This is exactly the color I envisioned," Margaret said, stepping back to admire a completed section. "Robert would have chosen something lighter, more traditional. But this feels like my choice, my aesthetic preference. It honors what he started while reflecting who I am now." The comment captured something essential about Margaret's journey over the past week. She wasn't trying to become someone completely different from the person she'd been during her marriage. She was discovering which aspects of her identity had been subsumed by partnership, and which elements were uniquely her own. As we worked through the afternoon, Margaret shared more detailed plans for her future with Charlie. She'd researched local hiking trails suitable for older dogs, identified a dog park where Charlie could socialize safely, and even considered volunteering with a golden retriever rescue organization. "I want to give back to the community that helped Charlie find me," she explained. "There are probably other dogs like him at the shelter right now. Senior animals who just need patient homes where they can finish their lives feeling loved and useful." The staining work required careful attention to detail and patience as each coat dried completely before the next application. Margaret approached the task with the same methodical thoroughness she'd brought to every aspect of the project. But now her movements showed confidence rather than tentative uncertainty. "Emma texted me this morning," Margaret said during one of our drying breaks. "She wants to visit next weekend to meet Charlie properly and see the finished deck. She also mentioned bringing her kids, which would be the first time they've been here since Robert's funeral." The prospect of hosting her grandchildren clearly pleased Margaret. She began planning activities that would showcase both the new deck and Charlie's gentle temperament. The house that had felt too quiet and empty was becoming a place where family gatherings seemed natural and welcome again. "I'm thinking about getting a fire pit for the deck," Margaret said, visualizing the space, "something safe and contained, so we could have evening gatherings even when the weather cools down. Charlie would love lying by a fire, and it would give us a reason to use the deck after sunset." Late in the afternoon, we applied the final coat of stain and began the careful process of removing painter's tape and cleaning up tools. The deck was essentially complete, needing only overnight drying time before it could be safely used. Margaret walked the entire perimeter, examining every detail with obvious pride and satisfaction. "It's beautiful," she said simply. "Better than I imagined when we started. But more than that, it represents something I didn't know I needed to prove to myself." "What's that?" "That I'm still capable of seeing difficult projects through to completion. That I can make good decisions about my home and my life. That age really is just a number when it comes to taking on new challenges and responsibilities." As we packed tools and covered the freshly stained deck to protect it from any overnight moisture, Margaret reflected on the week's unexpected developments. "When I called you about repairing this deck, I thought I was hiring someone to fix rotting wood. I had no idea I was beginning a process that would change my entire perspective on my capabilities and my future." Charlie had settled into his usual supervisory position, but now he seemed to understand that the project was winding down. He remained alert but relaxed, occasionally glancing between Margaret and me as if ensuring everyone was satisfied with the day's accomplishments. "What's next for you?" I asked, genuinely curious about Margaret's plans beyond the deck project. "Living," she said without hesitation. "Really living, not just surviving or maintaining. I want to explore hiking trails with Charlie, reconnect with friends I've been avoiding, maybe even travel to places Robert and I always talked about visiting. I want to approach each day as an opportunity rather than an obstacle." The transformation was complete and profound. Margaret had evolved from someone questioning her basic capabilities to someone confidently planning adventures and new experiences. The deck project had been the catalyst, but her own courage and resilience had driven every positive change. "I also want to help other people who might be facing similar crossroads," Margaret continued. "Whether that's through volunteering with senior dog rescues, mentoring other widows, or simply being a good neighbor who's available when someone needs practical help or emotional support." As I prepared to leave that evening, Margaret stood on her newly completed deck with Charlie at her side. The mahogany stain had dried to a rich, protective finish that would preserve the wood for years to come. But the deck itself was just one visible result of a week that had transformed Margaret's entire relationship with her home, her community, and her own capabilities. "Thank you," she said, "not just for the excellent craftsmanship, but for seeing me as someone capable of learning and contributing rather than just someone who needed work done. You gave me space to rediscover my competence and confidence." "You did all the real work," I replied. "I just provided tools and technical guidance. Everything else, the courage, the decision-making, the commitment to seeing it through, that was all you." Charlie wagged his tail as if agreeing with the assessment. His presence had completed something that construction work alone couldn't achieve. providing Margaret with daily purpose and companionship that extended far beyond home improvement projects. "The deck is finished," Margaret said, looking out at the beautiful space we'd created together. "But in many ways, this feels like the beginning rather than the end. The beginning of a different kind of life. One where I'm actively building rather than just maintaining. Where I'm moving toward new experiences rather than just preserving old memories." As I drove away that evening, I reflected on the privilege of witnessing Margaret's transformation. She'd proven that age truly was just a number when it came to learning new skills, taking on meaningful challenges, and building the kind of life that honored both past experiences and future possibilities. The deck would serve her well for years to come. But more importantly, the confidence and sense of purpose she'd rediscovered would support whatever adventures lay ahead for her and Charlie. The phone call came on a crisp December morning, 6 months after we'd completed Margaret's deck project. I recognized her number immediately, though I hadn't expected to hear from her. When I answered, her voice carried an energy and warmth that made me smile before she'd even explained why she was calling. "David, I hope I'm not bothering you, but I wanted to share some news. Actually, several pieces of news that I think you'll find interesting." I set down my coffee and settled in to listen. Margaret's tone suggested this would be more than a brief update. "First, Charlie and I just got back from a week-long camping trip to Sedona. Can you believe it? Me, camping at 54, with a golden retriever who apparently loves sleeping in tents almost as much as he loves hiking red rock trails." The image of Margaret camping was so far removed from the uncertain woman I'd met 6 months earlier that I had to chuckle. How did Charlie handle sleeping outdoors? Like he was born for it. He appointed himself camp guardian, which meant I slept better than I have in years knowing he was watching over everything. We hiked 5 different trails, met dozens of other dog owners, and I even learned to build a proper campfire. Robert would have been amazed. Margaret's voice carried genuine joy, rather than the wistful sadness that had characterized most references to her late husband when we first met. She'd found a way to honor his memory while creating entirely new experiences that were uniquely her own. "But that's not the main reason I called," she continued. "I wanted you to know that Emma is getting married next spring, and she's asked me to host the engagement party here at the house, on the deck we built together." The significance wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, Emma had been pressuring Margaret to sell the house and move to a retirement community. Now she was choosing that same house as the setting for one of the most important celebrations of her life. "Emma's fiancé is wonderful," Margaret said. "His name is Michael, and he's a veterinarian who absolutely adores Charlie. When Emma brought him to meet me last month, the first thing Michael did was ask about Charlie's health and exercise routine. Charlie gave his approval immediately, which as far as I'm concerned makes Michael perfect husband material." I could hear the pride in Margaret's voice as she described her daughter's relationship and the planning already underway for the engagement party. The woman who had once questioned her ability to maintain her home was now preparing to host a major family celebration. "We're planning for about 50 people in March, when the weather will be perfect for an outdoor party. I've already contacted a caterer, and I'm working with a florist to create arrangements that will complement the deck without overwhelming it." Emma initially offered to have the party at a restaurant, but I insisted that family celebrations should happen at home. The conversation revealed layers of positive changes that extended far beyond home maintenance and pet ownership. Margaret had reconnected with extended family members, re-established friendships that had languished during her period of grief, and even begun dating casually, something she mentioned with casual confidence rather than defensive explanation. "His name is Paul, and I met him at the dog park," she said with a laugh. "Charlie introduced us, actually. Paul has a chocolate lab named Benny, and the 2 dogs became instant friends. Paul and I started talking about our pets, then about hiking, trails, then about books and travel and all sorts of other things. We've been to dinner a few times, and he's coming to Emma's engagement party." The ease with which Margaret discussed this new relationship demonstrated how completely her perspective on her future had evolved. She wasn't desperately seeking someone to replace Robert. She was open to companionship and new experiences because she'd rebuilt her confidence and sense of self-worth. "I never thought I'd be interested in dating again," Margaret admitted. "Not because I thought it would be disloyal to Robert's memory, but because I couldn't imagine trusting someone else with my heart after experiencing such devastating loss. But Paul understands that Charlie and I come as a package deal, and he's not trying to replace anything or anyone. He's just adding something positive to a life that's already fulfilling. Margaret went on to describe other developments that painted a picture of someone fully engaged with life rather than merely surviving it. She'd joined a hiking group for people over 50, started volunteering at the Golden Retriever Rescue where she'd found Charlie, and even taken a woodworking class at the community college. The woodworking class was inspired by our deck project, she explained. I realized I genuinely enjoyed working with my hands and wanted to develop those skills further. I've made a coffee table, several picture frames, and I'm currently working on a dog bed frame for Charlie. The instructor says I have natural talent, which at my age feels like discovering a superpower I never knew I possessed. The conversation revealed that Margaret's transformation had rippled outward to affect other areas of her life and other people's lives as well. She'd become a mentor figure for other widows in her community, offering practical advice and emotional support based on her own experiences with grief and recovery. There's a support group that meets at the community center once a month, Margaret said. Women who've lost spouses and are trying to figure out how to rebuild their lives. I started attending about 3 months ago, initially just looking for connection with people who understood what I'd been through. But I discovered that sharing my story about the deck project and adopting Charlie was helping other women see possibilities they hadn't considered. Margaret described several women she'd befriended through the group, each facing their own version of the crossroads she'd navigated 6 months earlier. Some were dealing with adult children who wanted them to downsize their lives. Others were struggling with loneliness and loss of purpose, and many were questioning their ability to maintain independence as they aged. I tell them what you helped me learn, Margaret said. That age really is just a number when it comes to taking on new challenges, that we're more capable than we give ourselves credit for, that asking for help when you need it isn't the same as giving up control over your life. The support group had become so important to Margaret that she'd offered to host their next meeting at her house, using the deck as an example of what's possible when you stop focusing on limitations and start building toward the future you actually want. We're going to call it a possibilities party, Margaret said with obvious enthusiasm. Each woman will share one thing they've been afraid to try and one step they're willing to take toward making it happen. I think seeing the deck and meeting Charlie will help them visualize their own potential transformations. As our conversation continued, Margaret shared photos she'd taken during her camping trip with Charlie. Through her descriptions, I could picture them hiking together through red rock formations, Charlie's golden coat contrasting beautifully with the desert landscape, while Margaret documented their adventures with the enthusiasm of someone discovering travel photography as a new hobby. I've been thinking about taking a longer trip next year, Margaret said. Maybe driving up the coast to visit national parks in Utah and Colorado. Charlie loves car travel, and I love the idea of exploring places Robert and I always talked about, visiting but never got around to seeing. The conversation eventually turned to practical matters as Margaret described the ongoing maintenance and improvements she'd made to her house. True to her word, she'd hired professionals for major projects, while handling smaller tasks herself. The master bathroom renovation was scheduled for early next year, and she'd already selected tiles and fixtures that reflected her personal style preferences. I've also had the HVAC system serviced, the roof inspected, and the landscaping professionally maintained, Margaret reported. But I'm still doing all the interior painting myself, and I've learned to handle basic plumbing repairs. YouTube tutorials are amazing resources for learning practical skills. The most significant revelation came near the end of our conversation, when Margaret shared her decision to establish a scholarship fund in Robert's memory for young people pursuing careers in emergency services. The fund would provide financial assistance for training and equipment, ensuring that Robert's legacy of service would continue helping others long into the future. I wanted to do something that would honor his commitment to helping people while also giving me a meaningful way to channel my own desire to make a positive difference, Margaret explained. The scholarship fund allows me to transform grief into action, loss into legacy. The scholarship project had given Margaret a new sense of purpose that complemented rather than competed with her other activities and relationships. She was working with local fire departments and emergency medical services to identify deserving recipients, and she'd already begun fundraising efforts within her community. Emma has been incredibly supportive of the scholarship fund, Margaret said. She's helping me set up the legal structure and develop application criteria. It's become another way for us to work together towards something meaningful, which has strengthened our relationship tremendously. As our conversation drew to a close, Margaret reflected on the unexpected trajectory her life had taken since that morning when she'd called about deck repairs. 6 months ago, I was questioning my ability to handle basic home maintenance. Today, I'm planning camping trips, hosting engagement parties, mentoring other women, and establishing charitable foundations. The transformation still amazes me sometimes. The final surprise came when Margaret invited me to Emma's engagement party. I know it's not typical to invite your contractor to family celebrations, but you were part of the beginning of this new chapter in my life. It would mean a lot to have you there to see how the story has continued to unfold. After we hung up, I sat for a moment reflecting on Margaret's remarkable journey. The deck project had been completed months ago, but its impact on her life continued, to expand in ways neither of us could have predicted. She'd proven that 54 was indeed just a number, that resilience and growth were possible at any age, and that sometimes the most important construction projects involve rebuilding confidence and hope rather than just replacing rotted wood. Margaret's story had become a testament to the power of taking on meaningful challenges, the importance of community connections, and the truth that new beginnings are possible even after devastating losses. She'd transformed from someone questioning her capabilities to someone inspiring others to discover their own hidden strengths. The deck we'd built together would serve her well for years to come. But more importantly, the confidence and sense of purpose she'd rediscovered would support whatever new adventures awaited her. At 54, Margaret wasn't winding down her active life. She was proving that the best chapters might still be waiting to be written. Before ending our call, Margaret shared one final piece of news that perfectly encapsulated her transformation. I've been approached by the local newspaper to write a monthly column about reinventing yourself after major life changes. They want to call it Second Acts, and focus on people who've discovered new passions and purposes later in life. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. 6 months ago, Margaret had been avoiding social interactions and questioning her basic capabilities. Now a newspaper wanted to feature her as an inspiration to others facing similar crossroads. I'm nervous about the writing, Margaret admitted, but excited about the platform it would give me to reach people who might be struggling with the same fears and doubts I experienced. If sharing my story about the deck project and everything that followed can help even one person realize they're stronger than they think, then it's worth stepping outside my comfort zone again. Margaret went on to describe her plans for the column's first installment, which would focus on the difference between being stuck and being scared. I want to help people understand that fear of failure isn't a valid reason to avoid pursuing meaningful goals. The worst that could happen is you might need to adjust your approach or ask for help, but the alternative, giving up before you even try, guarantees the very outcome you're afraid of. Her words carried the authority of someone who had lived through profound loss and emerged stronger rather than diminished. Margaret had become living proof that resilience could be cultivated, that new skills could be learned at any age, and that community connections were essential for thriving rather than merely surviving. Charlie is sleeping next to my desk as I write my first draft, Margaret said with obvious affection. He's become my writing companion as well as my hiking partner. There's something about his calm presence that helps me organize my thoughts and find the right words to express complicated emotions. As we finally prepared to end our lengthy conversation, Margaret extended one more invitation that demonstrated how far she'd traveled from the isolated widow I'd first met. The community college has asked me to speak at their continuing education program about discovering new talents after age 50. I'd love for you to be there, since you witnessed the beginning of this journey and helped me take those first crucial steps toward rebuilding my confidence. The speaking engagement represented another milestone in Margaret's evolution from someone who avoided social interaction to someone actively sharing her experiences to benefit others. Her willingness to be vulnerable in public settings, to admit her former fears and doubts while celebrating her growth, showed remarkable courage and genuine desire to serve her community. I never imagined that repairing a deck would lead to all these opportunities and connections, Margaret reflected. But I suppose that's the point. We can't predict how small steps toward positive change will eventually transform our entire lives. The key is being brave enough to take that first step, even when you're not sure where it will lead. Her final words stayed with me long after we hung up. Age really is just a number, David. What matters is our willingness to keep growing, keep learning, and keep building the life we actually want, rather than just accepting whatever circumstances hand us. Margaret's story had become a testament to the transformative power of courage, community, and the willingness to discover capabilities you never knew you possessed. At 54, she had rebuilt not just her deck, but her entire relationship with possibility itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.